Say, I'm so glad you can join me for Understanding the Times Radio today. We're going to hear the voice of a longtime friend and somebody most of you know. And the reason I brought Dr. David Reagan on for the entire program today is that we're carrying one of his newer books. I'll give you the title here, and you're going to chuckle, I'm sure. And we're going to explain just why we have a book title like this. What's the difference in a millennium and a millipede? Understanding End Time Viewpoints. And I think the reason why the book is important is that it's going to help you know what it is you believe, and hopefully it's going to let you know what you need to stay away from when it comes to apologetics. And before I bring David on, let me just read 2 paragraphs from his book. He says here early on in the book, the signs of the times given to us in Bible prophecy are screaming from the heavens that Jesus is at the very gate of heaven, waiting for his Father's command to come for his church in what is called the rapture, an event that will take all believers out of this world before the Great Tribulation begins. And then he concludes this little segment here. He says, Christians need to live with an eternal perspective, yearning for the Lord's return. And then he says, but instead of yearning, they are yawning, and that needs to stop. The Bible promises a special reward for those who live daily with a desire for the Lord's return burning in their hearts. Here's how the Apostle Paul put it in 2 Timothy 4, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Again, that in David's new book, which we'll talk about at least for half of the program today, and then we might hit some current event issues. Dave Reagan, welcome back to Understanding the Times Radio.
Thank you, Jan. It's always a joy and a privilege and a blessing to be on the radio with you.
I've read your book here, Millennium and a Millipede, and by the way, you are so right as you outline in the book that there are terms, quite frankly, we may discuss some terms that half of my audience isn't familiar with. Historic premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism, preterism, pre-wrath, millennium, imminency, pre-tribulationism. Frankly, that could even scare some folks away, that and many, many other terms. But first, why did you title the book, What's the Difference in a Millennium and a Millipede?
First of all, I am writing for the person in the pew and not for academics or even for pastors, although I hope pastors would read the book. But I'm writing for the person in the pew, and I wanted to signal to people through that unusual title that this is something for people in the pew and not for scholars at a seminary, that I'm trying to put all this down so that everybody can understand it. That's the main reason that I gave it that title. I wanted to signal to people that it's a book that anyone can understand. The reason, though, I gave it that title, Jan, is because for 42 years I traveled around this country and all around the world holding Bible prophecy conferences. And I noticed over the years that whenever somebody particularly got their nose bent out of shape and came up afterwards and challenged me and began to rant and rave and carry on about how I didn't understand Bible prophecy, I would figure out within a minute that they really didn't know anything about Bible prophecy. And I always wanted to say, excuse me, do you know the difference in a millennium and a millipede? But I never did. I bit my tongue. I did not want to insult anybody, but that's where it came from. So I finally got it out.
Well, it's very catchy and it's very appropriate. Let's leave it at that. And by the way, David is the founder of Lamb Lion Ministries. And he stepped down into, I'm not going to say retirement because David did not retire. He's doing a whole lot in his semi-retirement, but he turned over the reins to
Colonel Tim Moore.
Yeah, Colonel Tim Moore, who we're going to have on air here in the fall. David, most of your followers, Lamb Lion followers, Olive Tree followers, are what's known as premillennial dispensationalists. Even though they may not know that's what they are, why don't you give that a definition? Again, that's a long term. Some people don't know. They know what they believe, but they don't know what title to put on it.
Jan, when you were talking a few minutes ago about all these different terms, I got tickled because some people think that Bible prophecy is written in unknown tongues.
Yeah, there you go.
And it really does take some study, but it's not really all that difficult. The viewpoint that I have is what I call modern premillennialism, and it's the view that Jesus Christ will return for his church first, before the tribulation begins. That he's going to come and call his church out of the world and take us back to heaven, where he's going to judge us of our works to determine our degrees of reward, not our salvation, but our degrees of reward. And then after all that is done and the rewards are handed out, he's going to sit down with us and have the greatest feast in the history of the cosmos, called the marriage feast of the Lamb. And we're going to celebrate the union of the church, which is the bride to the bridegroom Jesus. And then he's going to stand up and say, let's go. And he's going to break from the heavens and return, and we will return with him at what we call the second coming, which will occur at the end of the tribulation. So we call it premillennial because Jesus returns to this earth before the millennial reign takes place. Because when he returns, he will then begin to reign from Jerusalem over all the earth. And we call it the pre-trib, premillennial viewpoint, because we believe that the rapture will occur before the tribulation begins. So we believe that the second coming of Jesus is going to be in two phases. First, his appearing in the heavens, where he does not return to earth, but he just appears and takes his church out. And then second, his return to earth at the end of the tribulation, where he will reign for 1,000 years.
Right, but we also believe a literal Antichrist is going to be on the scene someday. Of course, that literal 7-year period of hell on earth, known as the time of Jacob's trouble or Daniel's 70th week. But there are a lot of theologies, David, that don't approach this the way we do, from amillennialism, preterism. We may not get to be able to define everything, folks. All of these things are defined in this book, which is why it's so helpful. So you can know not only what you believe, but you might know what the church down the street that might be, who knows, First Reformed Church, if you fill in the blank, and they might believe something. Not saying any of that is necessarily heresy, but it's different than what David and I would hold to. And I'm going to play a clip right now of somebody who is going to express his difference. And by the way, I'm not playing this clip of Voddie Baucham to bash him at all, but he speaks for what he believes as to theology, which is amillennialism. I'll let him share it, and then David and I will discuss it.
Nevertheless, there is a new test of eschatological orthodoxy that has arisen in recent days. As we've said throughout our time in Revelation, dispensational premillennialism dominates the current landscape. It is assumed by most Christians that that's the way you view the end times. I was alerted, I believe it was a couple of weeks ago, to a conversation on the World Wide Web as to whether or not I am an anti-Semite and whether or not all of my teaching is to be rejected because I do not hold to dispensational Zionism. This is huge, folks. This is a big deal for people. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that people are willing to bend on and give up on. But to not be a dispensational Zionist and to not believe that the current nation state of Israel is God's centerpiece as it relates to end time prophecy is for many people a bridge too far, completely unacceptable, and calls everything else into question. And there's the amillennial view. The amillennial view, again, a lot of people just go and they say, that means no or not, millennium. There is no millennium. That's not actually what the amillennial view is. The amillennial view sees the millennium as the age between Christ's first and second coming, which is now. The amillennial view is that Christ is reigning now. The amillennial view says that what happens at the end of this period of time is that Christ returns at the consummation of all things at the end of the age. Therefore, people who hold this view always view the 1,000 years as symbolic and have an already not yet approach to the future. Christ is reigning here and now, in and through his church, and yet his reign is not consummated until he returns in the future.
So I played that clip not as a slam at Voddie Baucham, but because he defined amillennialism as he is one. David, your thoughts on that?
I would disagree with the very first thing he said, and that is that the pre-trib, premillennial viewpoint that you and I hold dominates Christianity today.
That's
it
right.
does not.
It does not
even come close. The predominant view of both the Catholic Church and of major Protestant denominations is amillennialism. It has always been the predominant view, and it still is. Secondly, I was shocked when he talked about how Israel was not God's centerpiece of what's going on in the world today, because the Bible clearly prophesies over and over that in the end times God is going to regather the children of Israel from the four corners of the earth, and he is going to reestablish them as a state. And that people laughed at those prophecies for hundreds of years. They said no such thing could ever happen. For example, when C.I. Scofield wrote his Scofield Study Bible, he wrote in the footnotes that passages in Ezekiel indicated that in end times all the Jews are going to be regathered, and that Russia would come down against Israel in the war of Gog and Magog. And people said, how can that happen? And his response was, I don't know. The Bible says it, and therefore I believe it. He said, I believe that the Bible is giving us specific prophecies. Think what that meant at the time he wrote. He was back in 1910, 1912. Israel did not exist. Russia was a Christian Orthodox nation. So people mocked him. They said, how can a Christian Orthodox nation come against Israel when Israel doesn't even exist? Well, today we don't even stop and think about it, because Israel does exist, and Russia is not a Christian Orthodox nation anymore. And it just shows how Bible prophecy means what it says.
Yes.
And then he talks about Jesus reigning now. Jan, if Jesus is reigning now, he is doing a very, very bad job of it. Arnold Fruchtenbaum used to say, if Jesus is reigning now, then I must be living in the slum portion of the millennium, because we are living in a world where every nation in this world is in revolt against God, including this nation. The Bible says that during the reign of Jesus, that all the nations of the world are going to be in obedience to him. It says there's going to be peace, that there will be no war whatsoever, and there's wars going on all over the world today. It's why I categorize amillennialism as the unrealistic viewpoint, because it does not line up with what's going on in the world today. The world is not at peace. The animal kingdom has not been redeemed, and it says that it will be during the millennium. It says that there'll be no dangerous animals, that little boys will play with cobras because they won't be poisonous anymore. And it goes on to talk about how Jesus will reign in glory and majesty from Mount Sinai in Jerusalem. He's not doing that. What you have to do if you hold the amillennial viewpoint, you just simply have to spiritualize everything and say it doesn't mean what it says. And you and I, we take the position that if the plain sense makes sense, don't look for any other sense, or you'll end up with nonsense. For example, the 1,000 years in Revelation chapter 20, it says 6 times that Jesus is going to reign 1,000 years. And people say, well, that doesn't really mean 1,000 years. That's just an indefinite period of time. And the person who came up with that idea is St. Augustine around 400. And he wrote a book called The City of God, which is the best doorstop I've ever run across in my life. It's about 4 inches thick. And I read it recently for the first time ever. It was a painful process. And do you know that in that book, he says that the 1,000 years mentioned in the book of Revelation are simply symbolic.
The sad thing, Dave Reagan, is that so many denominations are amillennial. I have listeners right now who are in amillennial churches, and they may not know it, which, by the way, is a handy reason why you might want to pick up Dave Reagan's new book, What's the Difference in a Millennium and a Millipede? We're carrying it in my online store, olivetreeviews.org, so that you know what you believe and why you believe it. Or you might want to know what your church believes that you didn't know they believed it until we start talking about it or you start reading it in his book. So, David, the thing that jumped out at me there was Israel divides, and we represent some Zionist-type theology. It's only because the most common reference in the entire Bible is the importance of Israel, God's nation. He chose them to represent him, and he asks the entire world to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. If it's important to God, it's important to you and I.
It's so interesting that for hundreds of years people said those prophecies did not mean what they said, that they had to be spiritualized, that God was finished with Israel, washed his hands of Israel, has no purpose left for Israel, which of course was in direct contradiction to Romans 9 through 11, which says God still loves the Jewish people, still has a purpose for the Jewish people, in direct contradiction to what Jesus said. Jesus said, I will not return to this earth until the Jewish people are willing to say, Baruch haba Bashem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That means God has a purpose for the Jewish people.
Let me just move on to quote another paragraph from your book, because here's what I'm seeing. whether it's amillennialism or even kingdom now, dominion theology, is that all focus goes to the church for the last days. You write in your book, yet over 80% of all the commentaries I have consulted concerning this passage states that the 144,000 Jews are a symbol of the church. And then you say, how could that possibly be? The passage says that they are Jews. It even states that they will consist of the 12,000 Jews from each tribe of Israel. It then goes on into the detail of naming each tribe from which the men will be selective. And then you say, what else would God have to do to convince us that he's talking about 144,000 Jews? Would he have to put the message in neon lights in the heavens? And then you conclude, and why is this passage always twisted beyond recognition by spiritualizers who are determined to make it represent the church? The answer is easy. Most Christian theologians are advocates of replacement theology, which states that God washed his hands of the Jewish people when they rejected Jesus as their Messiah, and he replaced them with the new Israel, namely the church. That gets me back to my point I just made a second ago, Dave, and that is there's way too much emphasis now on the church is the center of everything as we wind the end of the church age down.
That's right. I would not accuse people today who are amillennial of being anti-Semitic. Some are, but I wouldn't accuse them of that. But certainly I would say without any hesitation whatsoever that all of the people involved in the 5th century in developing the amillennial viewpoint, all of them were virulently anti-Semitic. That's one of the reasons they developed amillennialism. They could not accept the concept that one day Jesus would return and that he would create a Jewish kingdom, and he would reign over all the world through the Jewish people and through their kingdom. And the idea that it says in Zechariah that in that time when he is doing that when a Jew walks by, 10 Gentiles will grab his robe and say, let us walk with you because we know that God is with you. They could not accept that. They just simply refused to accept it. They said it's not going to happen, and therefore they began to spiritualize all this. Another reason that they were so excited about the amillennial viewpoint is because it put the focus on the church, and it said, well, the church is really the kingdom of God on earth, and the church is the fulfillment of all these prophecies, and therefore the head of the church is the representative of God on earth. And it gave tremendous significance to the Pope and to the Catholic Church. These are the two major reasons, I believe, that amillennialism was developed.
I think the biggest change in my lifetime, and I'm kind of moving now away from the amillennial to talk a little bit more about kingdom now, dominion theology. And the most astounding thing I have seen is the rise of this kingdom now, dominion theology in the last 3-4 decades. I'm not sure when it became popular. I know that C. Peter Wagner kicked it off in the last 40 years. You can go to the website of Bethel Church Reading, and the first thing that you see in huge letters that are several inches high is that it should be on earth as it is in heaven. That is kingdom now, dominion theology. There's a song that's very popular by Carrie Job. I'm not commenting on Carrie. I'm sure she's a fine musician, but the words of the song here would be this. The church will arise with power and love. Our cities will know the glory of God. The future is bright. There's nothing to fear. Revival is now. The kingdom is here. Folks, that's kingdom now, dominion theology. The kingdom is not here now. The kingdom is coming. It'll be 1,000 years with Jesus ruling in Jerusalem. But have you watched this too, David?
Yes, what you're really talking about here is postmillennialism. It's the idea that not only is the kingdom here and now in the form of the church, but the kingdom is coming in its glory when the church takes over the world and reigns over all the world for 1,000 years. These people believe that we're just going to have unlimited revival in the future and that the church will convert the world. There's nothing more unbiblical, Jan, than that. The Bible teaches clearly that the vast majority of people will always reject the gospel. There'll never be a time when the world comes to Christ and Jesus is reigning over all the world because the church has converted the world, and the church presents the kingdom to Jesus at the end of the 1,000 years instead of him coming at the beginning. This viewpoint was the viewpoint of Protestant Christianity at the beginning of the 20th century. And Protestant Christianity said the 20th century is going to be the century of the church. The church will take over the world. They were all writing this in the 1890s. And then came World War I and World War II and the Great Depression, and this viewpoint just died. And then suddenly, at the end of the 20th century, it starts being revived from the dead. It's just unbelievable. We look around the world that we're living in today, and how can you believe things are getting better? The whole idea is based upon the inevitable progress of mankind, that things will get better and better as people are more educated and people understand each other better. And the Bible says just the opposite, that the closer we get to the coming of Jesus, the more society is going to become depraved.
Some other terms that people might have heard of in this vein that we're talking about: Reconstructionism, New Wave theology, Latter Rain, Manifest Sons of God, Kingdom Now, as I referenced, Dominion theology, as I referenced, all of those, and then David just brought up postmillennialism. All the attention goes off of Israel onto the church. And the church is going to do incredible things, they say, here in the last days. As a matter of fact, they say the church can make the world perfect. Folks, how's that working out for us, huh? Not working out real well. David talks about these issues and theologies, again, in the book, and we have it in our store, or you can call us. What's the difference in a millennium and a millipede? He's even got a chapter in there, thankfully, on the millennium, and I find that whole topic very fascinating because, David, I really never wanted to come back to this earth for 1,000 years, but we're going to do that in the millennium, and that's when all the promises to Israel are given to Israel. But as you said, my goodness, it's going to be a time of near perfection.
It is, and I can hardly wait for the millennial reign of Jesus. It is going to be wonderful. It gives me so much hope. As I look around, every morning I get up, I'll turn on Fox News,
I know,
and it makes me sick. One horrible thing after another, and every time I think it can't get worse, it gets worse. Then my hope is that I look to the future. I know what God has promised. People who are amillennial have not studied Bible prophecy to believe it means what it says, and the result is they don't have the kind of hope for the future that people who believe in premillennials have. I have great hope because I know Jesus is coming to reign. My wife suffered from dementia.
Yes.
For 5 years, I went and fed her every evening, and I read to her, and I exercised her. And she didn't even know who I was. But I would always end every evening by reading to her Romans 8:18 that says, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to even be compared to the glory that is yet to be revealed to us. I put that on her tombstone marker because we just can't even imagine all the glory. Paul put it this way, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor has the mind of man conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. But the Bible tells us a lot about that if you will believe what it says. The problem is that most people spiritualize all this. In fact, Jen, I grew up in an amillennial church.
Yes.
And I was taught that the Bible means exactly what it says from beginning to end unless it's talking about the second coming. And they said it never means what it says when it's talking about second coming.
It's amazing that you ended up being a leader and a prominent speaker on behalf of premillennial dispensationalism.
The turning point for me was when I read the book of Zechariah. And people told me that Zechariah just doesn't mean what it says. It's got to be spiritualized and all that. But then I noticed something as I read it. Zechariah is full of prophecies about the first coming of Jesus. And every one of those prophecies was fulfilled literally. And it suddenly struck me, if the first coming prophecies meant what they said, the second coming prophecies must mean what they say. You know, that wasn't some space scientist thing. It was just common sense.
Folks, you're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. Jan Markell, your host, talking to Dave Reagan in Texas. My position on what we're talking about, David, is that there's simply no way to understand our times without the Bible and the correct interpretation from the Bible. In other words, premillennial dispensationalism is the only doctrine that can make sense of our times. We see the days of Noah coming back. We see Israel's prominence. We see the church in apostasy. We see America in decline because global government has to arise. And there are no other theologies other than what you and I hold to, other than premillennial dispensationalism, that's going to teach these things properly and their biblical role. And I know you would agree with that.
I agree with it 100%. In fact, Jan, recently I was having lunch with an older Christian friend, and we were talking about Bible times, and he said, David, wouldn't it have been exciting to live in Bible times? And I said, sir, we are.
Yeah.
We are living in Bible times. We're seeing prophecies 2,700 years old being fulfilled before our very eyes.
See, I just want to insert a comment or two in light of what happened in America this past week. And by the way, my interview with Dave Reagan was pre-recorded, so I was unable to bring this discussion into the hour with him, but I'm going to talk about it right now just for a minute, because last Monday something unprecedented happened in America. I believe it's a harbinger of some grave and serious things to come. First, quite frankly, a lunacy bill was passed in the Senate authorizing, among other things, the IRS to come against honest Americans, and make no mistake, they will. Our most incompetent vice president broke the 50-50 tie in the Senate, allowing their controversial bill to be passed. It will inflate the IRS to one of the largest federal organizations in America. Also on Monday, the FBI declared war on American citizens when they raided former President Trump's home in Florida. They can make any excuse they want, but the bottom line is Donald Trump does not fit the agenda of the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, and their global government. He is about America first, and anyone with an America first mentality must be dealt with firmly. So America first is a bridge too far for the one-worlders or anyone on the left. Folks, we are watching the weaponization of government for power. The current administration is acting, if I can be so blunt, like the Gestapo. They are as lawless as any street thug conducting a smash-and-grab operation. What we saw go down in Mar-a-Lago last Monday, the raiding of a former president's personal home by the very administration that feels politically threatened by the former president, is but one more confirmation that we no longer live in a free republic. We are fast heading into a police state or a banana republic. And make no mistake, this is paving the way for the Antichrist, the man of ultimate lawlessness. It also is bringing us to the threshold of the tribulation and the rapture of the church. We are in those predicted perilous times. But note that we have a government out of control, that normal isn't likely to come back anytime soon, if ever, but always remember that Jesus is coming back, and he's coming back any day.